Hello everyone, in today's video I will be narrating stories that I found off of Reddit. If you enjoyed this video, make sure you subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But without further ado,
let's get straight into these stories.
I never take the bus super late at night. I usually drive, but my car had broken down earlier that day and my only option was the city bus. It was a little past 2 a.m. and I was the only one at the stop. The streets were quiet, just the occasional distant sound of a siren or a drunk stumbling home. When the bus pulled up, it was mostly empty except for the driver and a single passenger, a woman sitting in the very back. She was wrapped in a long coat, her face obscured by the dim light. I sat near the middle, a few seats away from the exit. The driver didn't acknowledge me, just stared ahead, gripping the wheel tightly. That should have been my first clue. A few minutes into the ride, I heard movement from the back. The woman had shifted slightly, her posture stiff. I didn't think much of it at first, until I realized something weird. She wasn't reflected in the window. I blinked, thinking my tired brain was playing tricks on me. But no, as the city lights passed by, I could see my reflection clear as day, yet where hers should have been, there was only the empty seat. The bus rumbled on, and I forced myself to keep my eyes forward. My heart was hammering in my chest, and I told myself there had to be a logical explanation. Then I heard her whisper, not loud, not directed at me, just a low, breathy murmur, like she was speaking to someone who wasn't there. I glanced at the driver, expecting him to react. He didn't. His knuckles were white on the wheel, his eyes fixed on the road like he was afraid to look anywhere else. Then the bus hit a red light. The murmuring stopped. The silence was worse. I felt her eyes on me. My skin crawled, but I forced myself not to turn around. The bus started moving again. Another stop was coming up. Thank God. I yanked the cord, signaling to get off, not caring if it was too early for my destination. The driver sighed. It wasn't relief, more like resignation. The doors hissed open. I bolted out. As I walked away, I risked one last glance. The woman had moved. She was now sitting in the seat closest to where I had been, staring directly at me through the window. Then she smiled. The bus pulled away, disappearing into the night. I walked the rest of the way home, heart pounding, refusing to look behind me. I still don't know what I saw that night. I tried to forget about that night. I told myself I had imagined things, that sleep deprivation and paranoia had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew better. Still, life went on and my car got fixed, and I didn't have to rely on the bus anymore. Weeks passed, then months, and then I saw her again. It was late, just past midnight. I had been out with some friends, and since I'd had a few drinks, I decided to take a rideshare home instead of driving. As I waited on the curb, watching from my driver's car, I felt that same feeling, like someone was watching me. I turned my head slowly across the street. At a dimly lit bus stop, she sat, same log coat, same stiff posture, and even from that distance, I could feel her eyes on me. The bus pulled up in front of her, blocking my view. My breath caught in my throat as I watched the doors open, expecting her to get on. But when the bus pulled away, she was gone and just an empty bench. My phone buzzed. It was my driver telling me he'd arrived. I nearly jumped out of my skin at the sound. I got in the car and tried to calm my nerves, but something felt off. The driver was silent, eyes locked on the road, hands gripping the wheel tightly, just like that bus driver. I swallowed hard. Hey, oh, everything okay? He didn't answer right away. Then, in a low, strained voice, he asked, did you see her too? My blood ran cold. I didn't respond. I couldn't. He nodded, like that was answer enough. I'd seen her before, he murmured. Twice now. Always late at night. Always just watching. I clenched my hands together to stop them from shaking. What happens if she follows you? I asked, barely above a whisper. His grip on the wheel tightened. You don't let her in. We drove the rest of the way in silence. When we reached my place, he looked at me in the mirror. Don't take the bus at night, he said, and if you see her again, don't look too long. I nodded numbly and got out, locking my door the second I stepped inside. I didn't sleep at night, and I don't take ride shares anymore either, because last night, I woke up to a soft whisper outside my bedroom window. I barely slept after that night. Every sound, every shadow made my skin crawl. I kept telling myself it was my imagination, that maybe the drinks had messed with my head. But deep down, I knew better. And then, 3 nights later, my phone rang at exactly 2:07 a.m. I was in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that nothing was wrong, when the sound shattered the silence. The caller ID said unknown number. I almost didn't answer. Almost. But something in me, some deep, terrible instinct, knew who it was before I even brought the phone to my ear. I didn't say anything. For a moment, there was just silence. Then, a whisper, soft, like breath against the speaker. You saw me. I shot up upright, my heart hammering so hard I thought it might stop. My throat went dry, my hands clammy against the phone. Then the whisper came again, barely audible but unmistakable. "You let me see you too long." I hung up and threw the phone across the room. It clattered onto the floor, the screen still glowing. I sat there, frozen, barely breathing. My whole body was screaming at me to move, to do something, but I just sat, staring at my door, waiting. And then 3 slow knocks, soft and deliberate, right outside my bedroom door. Not my apartment door, my bedroom door. I couldn't move. I couldn't blink. Then came the whisper again, this time right outside the door, inches from where I sat. "You don't let me in." My chest tightened. I don't know how long I sat there, but eventually the silence stretched. The air grew heavy, suffocating. Then nothing. No footsteps. No retreating presence. Just absence. I sat awake until morning, every light on, clutching a knife I knew was useless. When the sun rose, I finally forced myself to move. Slowly, I crossed the room, my breath shallow. I gripped the handle. The door was unlocked. I know I locked it. I know I did. I haven't slept since, and I know this isn't over. I used to take the same city bus home from work every night. It was a late route, the kind that picked up stragglers from closing shifts, a few night owls, and the occasional person who just had nowhere else to be. I never thought much about it until the night I stayed on too long. That night, I had my earbuds in, half dozing in my usual window seat. The bus was emptier than usual, just me and a guy near the front, plus the driver. I recognized both of them. The man up front was an older guy with tired eyes and a fraying jacket. I'd seen him before, always getting off near the same stop as me. The driver was new. I hadn't seen him before, but that wasn't uncommon. I must have drifted off, because when I looked up, we were well past my stop, way past. The city streets had given way to dark roads lined with nothing but trees. "Hey," I called, standing up. "I think I missed my stop." The driver didn't react. He just kept driving, his eyes fixed ahead. The old man at the front turned and looked at me. His expression was strange, tired, yes, but also something else. Resigned. "You should sit down," he said. Something about his tone sent a chill through me. "Where are we going?" I asked. The driver didn't answer. The bus rumbled in. No stops, no turns, just a straight, endless road. The lights inside the bus flickered, and for the first time, I noticed something odd. There were no ads on the ceiling, no maps, no route information, just smooth metal and flickering fluorescence. I pulled out my phone. No signal. The old man sighed, like he had seen this before. "You weren't supposed to stay on," he murmured. "What does that mean?" I demanded. But before he could answer, the driver finally spoke. "You'll have to get off soon." His voice was strange, flat, and motionless. The bus was slowing. I looked out the window. Nothing. Just a stretch of road disappearing into the dark. No houses, no streetlights, not even a shoulder to stand on. "No," I said. "I want to go back." The driver didn't respond. The old man stood. His movements were slow, reluctant. "This is the last stop," he said. The bus halted. The doors hissed open. Darkness outside. Deep, endless, waiting. I stayed frozen. The old man gave me one last look. Then, with a sigh, he stepped off. The doors shut behind him. The bus groaned and pulled forward again. I turned in my seat, watching through the back window. The man stood on the empty road, watching us go. Then, as the bus pulled further away, I saw it. Shadows closing in around him, silent and shifting. He didn't move, didn't try to run, just stood there as the dark swallowed him whole. I turned back to the driver. "Take me back," I whispered. This time, he listened. I got off at the next stop, stumbling into the cold air, barely able to breathe. When I turned to look back, the bus was gone. I never saw it again, never found that route again. But sometimes, late at night, when I walk past the stop where I used to catch it, I think I see something down the road. Headlights, far off, waiting. For a while, I tried to put it out of my mind. Maybe I'd imagined some of it. Maybe I had just been exhausted, and my brain had twisted an ordinary, if eerie, experience into something worse. But deep down, I knew better. I stopped taking the bus after that night. I carpooled, I walked, I took rides from friends, anything to avoid standing at a stop past midnight, watching for headlights that I prayed wouldn't appear. And it worked for a time. And then, last week, something happened. I was walking home from a friend's place. My usual paranoia kept at bay by the noise of the city around me. It was early, barely past 10. Streetlights glowed yellow, cars rushed by, and everything felt normal. Then, ahead of me, I saw it. A bus. Not just any bus. That bus. It was parked in a stop that hadn't existed before. Its doors open, its interior lights flickering weakly. There were no route numbers, no destination sign, just a blank, darkened display. and inside, sitting in my old window seat, was the old man. He was staring at me. I froze. Everything in me screamed to turn around, to run, to not acknowledge what I was seeing, but I didn't move. The driver, the same driver, turned his head slightly like he had just noticed me standing there. His expression didn't change. Then, without a sound, the doors hissed shut. The bus pulled away from the curb. No engine noise, no exhaust, just a whisper of tires on pavement. I stood there, heart pounding, watching as it drove down the street and disappeared around the corner. I don't know why it came back. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the old man staring at me from that window seat. Not pleading, not afraid, just watching. The next morning, I convinced myself I had imagined it. Stress, exhaustion, lingering fear from that night months ago. It had to be one of those things. But I also knew better than to take chances. I changed my walking routes, avoided public transit altogether, even switched up my work schedule so I wouldn't be out late. For a while, it helped. Then, 3 nights ago, my phone rang. I was in bed, drifting between sleep and wakefulness when the buzzing jolted me fully awake. The caller ID just said unknown number. I never answered those, but something about this one made my stomach twist. I let it ring. It stopped, then started again and again. On the 4th call, I picked up. I didn't say anything, just held the phone to my ear, waiting. For a moment, there was only static, faint, distant, like an old radio trying to find a signal. Then I heard it, a voice. Last stop. I hung up, tossed the phone across the room, but the calls didn't stop. I turned the phone off, but an hour later, it was ringing again. Still off. It still vibrated across my nightstand. I didn't sleep. The next morning, I changed my number. It didn't matter. That night, at exactly 12:03 a.m., my new phone rang. Unknown number. I didn't answer, but a message came through immediately after. One image, a blurry, grainy photo of a bus stop. My bus stop, the same one I used to wait at every night. The street was empty, but in the distance, I could see something. Headlights, coming closer. I didn't go outside. I didn't even look out my window. I just sat in the dark, heart pounding, waiting for the next call. I used to work the closing shift at a small, family-owned pharmacy in a quiet part of town. It wasn't a 24-hour place, and most of our customers were elderly folks picking up prescriptions before we shut our doors at 9 p.m. The pharmacy had been around for decades, and the owners had inherited it from their parents. It had that old-world charm, wooden shelves, an ancient cash register, and a tiny back room where we kept extra stock. The building itself had a 2nd floor, but as far as I knew, it had been abandoned for years. There was an old wooden staircase in the back, behind a locked door. The owners told me it used to be a small apartment, but it had been empty for decades. No one goes up there, they said, brushing it off whenever I asked. One night, I was finishing up the closing routine. My coworker had already left, and I was alone. The last customer had picked up their prescription, and I was finishing paperwork at the counter. It was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerators. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate thump from upstairs. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. The noise wasn't the creak of an old building settling, it was heavier, like a footstep. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe an animal had gotten in, a raccoon, a bird, but then it came again. Thump, thump. It was unmistakably footsteps. Slow, measured, pacing. I told myself it was just my imagination, but then the sound changed. Scrape. It was the sound of something dragging across the floor directly above me. My blood ran cold. I had worked here for over a year, and I had never heard a single noise from upstairs. I grabbed my phone, ready to call someone, but then something else happened. The old wooden staircase door, the locked door, gave a single, slow creak. I turned my head toward it, hard hammering. It had always been locked, always, but now it was slightly ajar, not open enough to see inside, just enough to show me it wasn't locked anymore. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my bag and bolted for the front door, fumbling with my keys as I nearly crashed through it. I locked it behind me, sprinted to my car, and drove off without looking back. The next morning, I told my boss what had happened. His face turned pale. That door should never be open, he said quietly. Then, after a pause, we'll change the locks. I never got an answer to what or who was up there, but I never worked another closing shift again. After that night, I refused to close alone. The owners didn't question it, and for a while, things seemed normal. They changed the locks on the back door, though I never got a clear answer as to why it had been opened in the first place. But normal didn't last long. A few weeks later, I started noticing small things. Items would be slightly out of place when I opened in the morning. Nothing major, just little shifts. A bottle of aspirin facing the wrong way, a box of cough syrup sitting on the wrong shelf. At first, I blamed my coworkers, but then one morning, I found something that made my stomach drop. A dusty footprint. It was on the floor behind the counter near the prescription shelves. Not a shoe print, a bare footprint, too large to be from any of us who worked there. And the worst part, there was no dust anywhere else, just that single, perfect print. I told my boss. He looked at it, frowned, then wiped it away with his shoe. Probably nothing, he muttered, but I saw it on his face. He didn't believe that. That night, I left as soon as my shift ended, not even waiting for my coworker to finish locking up. As I got into my car, I glanced back at the building, and I saw it. A shadow in the upstairs window. It moved, just barely. A flicker of motion, like someone shifting their weight. I felt an ice-cold wave of dread, but I couldn't look away. The window was grimy, but I could make out just enough to tell that something, or someone, was up there. Then the light in the window flickered, not like a normal light. It was dim, an almost unnatural glow, as if something was moving in front of it, blocking it. I don't remember driving home. I just remember locking my apartment door and shoving a chair under the handle before lying awake until dawn. The next day, I called in sick. When I finally worked up the courage to go back a few days later, I found out the pharmacy had been broken into. Nothing had been stolen, though. No cash, no drugs, nothing. Just one thing was different. The new lock on the back staircase door. It was broken, not picked, broken, as if someone had forced their way through. The owners didn't say much, but they had a contractor come in the next day. I overheard something about sealing it up for good. A week later, a heavy wooden panel covered the door, bolted straight into the wall. No one ever talked about it again, and no one ever went upstairs. I quit a month later. To this day, I don't know who or what was up there. I don't know if it was a squatter, something worse, or just my imagination. But I do know one thing. That night when I saw the shadow, I don't think it was looking out at the street. I think it was looking directly at me. I thought leaving the pharmacy would give me peace. That once I quit, the unease, the wrongness would fade like a bad dream. But it didn't. For weeks after, I had the same nightmare. I was back inside the pharmacy, standing behind the counter. The store was empty, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. Then, like clockwork, I'd hear it. Thump, thump, footsteps above me. Slow, heavy, deliberate. I would try to move, to run, but my feet wouldn't budge. The sound would grow louder, coming closer. But instead of staying overhead, it would start moving downward, down the staircase. And just like in real life, the door that should be locked, should be sealed shut, would creak open just enough to show darkness beyond. Something would shift in the shadows. Something would step closer, but I never saw it. Because just as I was about to, just as my eyes were forced to adjust, I'd wake up, heart hammering, drenched in sweat. It happened over and over. A suffocating sense of dread followed me even when I was awake. I stopped sleeping properly, stopped going near that part of town altogether. But here's the part that still haunts me. One night, around 3 in the morning, my phone buzzed. A text message. I groggily reached for my phone, my body heavy with exhaustion. The number was unknown. The message was simple. Why did you leave? Every hair on my body stood on end. I stared at the screen, sleep vanishing instantly. My breath came in short, shallow gasps. I wanted to believe it was a prank, but deep down, I knew better, because as I stared at that message, heart pounding, another came through. A single image, a photo of the pharmacy, but not just any photo. It was taken from inside the store. The angle was low, just behind the counter, exactly where I used to stand. I could see the empty aisles, the faint reflection of the glowing exit sign in the front window, and just at the edge of the frame, almost out of sight, was the staircase door, wide open. I threw my phone across the room. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I went to the police. I showed them the messages, the photo, told them everything. They took my statement, but there wasn't much they could do. The number was untraceable. The pharmacy hadn't reported any break-ins. There was no evidence of anything unnatural. I asked if they could check the building anyway. They did. And when they called me later that afternoon, their tone was, the door was locked. They said it sealed up tight, just like the owner said it was. I almost got relief. Almost, until the officer hesitated. But, he added, his voice uncertain, we found something weird upstairs. I didn't want to ask, but I did. His answer, a mattress, old, stained, shoved into the corner. Next to it, a pile of empty water bottles, wrappers from snacks we didn't even sell at the pharmacy. And on the floor, deep, uneven scratches in the wood, like something or someone had been dragging their nails across it. I hung up. I didn't want to know more. I changed my number the next day, moved to a new apartment 2 weeks later. I haven't been back to that pharmacy since. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that room, about the messages, about the photo, and about the question I never answered. Why did I leave? Because something up there, something in that room, wanted me to stay. A few months ago, I went to an art museum alone. It was something I did often, wandering through exhibits, letting my mind drift, losing myself in colors and brushstrokes. The museum had a cafe on the second floor, tucked away behind a glass wall. It wasn't crowded that day, just a few other visitors quietly drinking coffee, flipping through exhibition brochures. I ordered a tea and took a seat near the window, overlooking the courtyard below. A pianist played softly in the distance, just background ambience. The air smelled like espresso and fresh pastries. I was halfway through my drink when I noticed a man sitting a few tables away. He wasn't eating or drinking, just sitting, hands folded, staring at me. At first, I assumed I had something on my face. I wiped my mouth with a napkin, glanced at my reflection in the window. Nothing seemed off. I looked back. He was still watching, and I avoided eye contact and pulled out my sketchbook, hoping he'd lose interest. But he didn't. I could feel his gaze, unwavering. Minutes passed. Then he stood up. I tensed, pretending to be engrossed in my drawing. But instead of leaving, he walked over and sat down across from me. No greeting, no hesitation, just settled in as if he belonged there. Up close, he looked rugged. His skin was too smooth, his lips just slightly too thin. His expression never changed. "You don't remember me, do you?" he said. His voice was flat, almost mechanical. I forced a polite smile. "I think you have me mistaken for someone else." He shook his head, slow and deliberate. "No, I don't." I pushed back from the table slightly, heart pounding. "I really think you do." He blinked once, too slow. Then he said, "You left the door open." The air felt suddenly cold. I had no idea what he meant. I was sure I had locked my apartment before coming here, but now doubt crept in like an unwanted draft. I swallowed hard. "I don't know what you're talking about." He smiled. It was the first change in his expression. It was wrong, too. Like he was mimicking something he had seen, not something he felt. Then, as if satisfied, he stood up and walked away. I sat there, frozen, watching him disappear into the museum. I waited a few minutes before grabbing my things and leaving. When I got home, my apartment door was locked, exactly as I had left it. But inside, on my kitchen counter was a single museum cafe napkin. That night, I barely slept. I told myself I had just imagined things, that maybe I had picked up the napkin myself without remembering. But the unease gnawed at me, the way he had spoken, the way he had looked at me, the way he had known something about me that he shouldn't have. I double-checked my locks before bed, twice. The next morning, I tried to shake it off. It was just a weird encounter, right? Some strange guy trying to mess with me. It didn't mean anything. Then I got a text. "Unknown number. You still leave the door open." My stomach turned. I hadn't given anyone my number. I barely even posted on social media. How did he find me? I locked my phone, shoved it into my pocket, and tried to breathe. I wasn't going to panic. Not yet. Instead, I decided to retrace my steps. Maybe I had left my door open at some point and didn't realize. Maybe this was some elaborate prank. So I went back to the museum. The cafe was exactly as I had left it. Quiet. There was no sign of him. I asked the barista if she remembered a man sitting near me the day before. She frowned. "You were sitting alone," she said. "No, there was a man. He sat right over there." I pointed to the table. She shook her head. "I don't remember anyone sitting there." My skin prickled. Maybe she just hadn't noticed him. Maybe he had been too quiet, too still. Or maybe. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. "Unknown number. You shouldn't have come back." I turned around so fast I nearly knocked over a chair. My eyes scanned the cafe, the museum lobby, the glass doors leading outside. He wasn't there, but I knew he was watching. I left immediately. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I kept my lights on, my bedroom door locked. I even set up a small barricade of furniture near my front door, just in case. At 3:12 a.m., my doorbell rang. I didn't move, didn't breathe. Then, the sound of paper sliding under my door. I waited until morning to check. A single museum cafe napkin. On it, in neat, deliberate writing, "The door is still open." I moved out a week later. To this day, I don't know how he found me. I don't know who he was. But sometimes, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I swear I hear footsteps outside my new apartment. I told myself it was over, that moving away had solved it, that he, whoever he was, couldn't follow me forever. But the fear never fully left. Every knock at the door made my stomach clench. Every unfamiliar number that called me made my skin crawl. For months, nothing happened. No texts, no napkins, no signs that he had ever existed outside of my paranoia. Until last week. It was a normal evening. I had just gotten home from work, tired, hungry. I kicked off my shoes, set my bag down, and flicked on the kitchen light. And that's when I saw it. A single museum cafe napkin, sitting on my kitchen counter, exactly where I had found the first one. I froze. My apartment was locked. The windows were shut. Nothing looked disturbed. But he had been here. I picked up the napkin with trembling fingers. This time, there was no message. Just a small, perfect key taped to the center. I had never seen it before. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I took the key to a locksmith, hoping it was some generic, meaningless thing. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe it was a key to nothing. The locksmith examined it for a long moment, then frowned. Where did you get this? I hesitated. I found it in my apartment. He gave me a strange look. This is a master key. It's old, but whoever has this can open a lot of doors. I felt my stomach drop. Like apartment doors? I asked, dreading the answer. The locksmith nodded. Yep, high security buildings, hotels, places with universal locks. You might want to check with your landlord. I left without saying another word. I didn't go home. Instead, I went to a friend's place across town and called my building manager. I kept my voice calm, casual. Just wanted to ask about the locks. I said, just curious. He sighed and admitted something he probably shouldn't have. The building had one master key, used by maintenance, emergencies only, kept in a locked box in his office, or at least, it was supposed to be there. It had gone missing a few months ago. I hung up. Then my phone buzzed. Unknown number. The door is open again. I haven't been back to my apartment since. I don't know what he wants. I don't know how he got in. I don't know how long he's been watching, but I do know one thing. Wherever I go, whatever door I close behind me, he already has the key. I work as a late shift janitor at a small regional airport. It's not a big hub, just a handful of terminals, mostly for domestic flights. By the time I get in, most of the flights have landed, and the airport is practically empty aside from a few workers and the occasional stranded traveler sleeping in a chair. It was a Thursday night, and I was pushing my cleaning cart down one of the concourses when I noticed a man sitting alone at one of the gates. No luggage, no phone, just sitting there, staring at the empty jet bridge like he was waiting for a plane that was never coming. That wasn't particularly weird. People got stuck in layovers all the time, but something about him made me uneasy. He was wearing a suit, but it looked a little wrong, like it had been borrowed or was a few decades out of fashion. His shoes were polished, but the soles looked almost untouched, like he hadn't walked much in them, and his hair, neatly combed back, didn't move at all, even though the vents overhead were blowing air strong enough to rustle the pages of an abandoned newspaper nearby. I kept my head down and kept working, but as I passed, he turned to me and said, "You should go home early tonight." His voice was calm, measured, but it made my stomach drop. I stopped and turned to him. "Excuse me, you should go home early," he repeated, tilting his head slightly like he was considering something. "You don't want to be here for what's coming." I let out a nervous chuckle, assuming he was messing with me. "Sir, if you need assistance, I can call security." He interrupted, "You won't make it to security in time." That's when I felt a chill crawl up my spine. Something about the way he said it. It wasn't a threat, but it felt like a fact. I glanced around, suddenly hyper aware of how empty the concourse was. The nearest airport worker was at the far end of the terminal, completely out of earshot. The security desk was even farther. I forced a laugh. "All right, sir, have a good night," I said, turning my car around. "You were almost named Robert," he said, just as I was about to leave. I stopped. My mother once told me that Robert was the name she originally picked for me before changing her mind last minute. No one else knew that. I turned back, my mouth dry. "How do you?" But the man was gone. The set was empty. The entire row of chairs was empty. There was no way he could have walked away that fast. I stood there, heart pounding, scanning the entire concourse, but there was nothing. No footsteps, no sound, just silence. I went home early that night, and the next morning, when I turned on the news, I saw that a flight that was supposed to land at my airport had crashed in the middle of the night. A maintenance issue. No survivors. I checked the schedule. That flight had been assigned to the gate where I met the man. I don't know who he was, what he was, or how he knew my name. I didn't go back to work for a few days after that. I told my boss I had food poisoning, but the truth was, I just couldn't bring myself to walk through those airport doors again. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the empty chair. I heard his voice. "You don't want to be here for what's coming. It should have been a coincidence, a freak accident, and an unsettling conversation overlapping by chance." That's what I told myself over and over, but I didn't believe it, because the next time I saw him, he didn't just know my name. He knew something else. A week after the incident, I forced myself to return to work. I was jumpy, but nothing weird happened that first night, or the second, or the third. By the end of the week, I was starting to convince myself that I had overreacted. Maybe the guy was just some eccentric traveler messing with me. Then, one night, as I was mopping the floor near the security checkpoint, I heard someone call my name. "Jason." My breath caught in my throat. I turned around slowly, and there he was. The same suit, the same polished shoes, the same perfectly combed back hair that didn't move. He stood just past the metal detectors, hands in his pockets, watching me. I gripped the mop handle tight. "What do you want?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he studied me, his expression unreadable. unavoidable. Then he said, "Your mother will call you at 3:14 a.m. Answer it." I blinked. What? He didn't repeat himself. He just smiled slightly like he knew something I didn't, then turned and walked through the checkpoint. The alarm went off. No one stopped him. By the time I rushed forward to get a better look, he was already gone. The airport was practically empty at that hour, and yet somehow he had vanished again. I told myself not to panic, not to let this guy get inside my head. Then, at exactly 3:14 a.m., my phone rang. I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I almost didn't pick up, almost let it go to voicemail, because some part of me was terrified of what she was about to say. But I answered. She was crying. My uncle, her brother, had a heart attack in his sleep. I don't know how he do. I don't know what he is. But I know this. He isn't just some ordinary man. I stopped working nights. After my mom's call, I put in a request to switch to day shifts. My boss wasn't happy about it, but I didn't care. I couldn't be at that airport at night anymore, not when he might be waiting for me. For a while, it worked. I saw normal people, normal passengers, nothing strange. The airport during the day was full of life, full of noise. I convinced myself that whatever had happened was over. Then, last Tuesday, I saw him again. I was on my lunch break, sitting in the food court, scrolling through my phone, when I felt someone watching me. I looked up. He was sitting at a table across from mine, perfectly still, his hands folded neatly on the surface. The same suit, the same shoes, the same unmoving hair. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat. "You changed your schedule," he said. His voice was calm, almost amused. I gripped my phone so hard my fingers ached. "You need to leave me alone," I said. "Whatever game this is, I've done it." He tilted his head slightly, considering me. "Jason," he said, "tomorrow at 2:07 p.m. don't step outside." I stood up, my chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Stay away from me," I snapped. People were starting to stare. He just smiled, a slow, knowing smile. I turned and walked away, forcing myself not to run. The next day, at exactly 2:07 p.m., I was in the airport maintenance room, counting down the seconds. I wasn't going outside. I wasn't going anywhere near a door. At 2:10 p.m., my phone buzzed with a news alert. A taxi had jumped the curb outside the airport and plowed through the pedestrian walkway. 2 people were injured. 1 person was killed, a maintenance worker. I scrolled down, my stomach twisty. I knew him. His name was Chris, and he always took a smoke break around 2 p.m. I sat there, staring at my screen, feeling the blood drain from my face. I didn't know what to think. Did that man save me? Did he know something? Or was he just playing some sick game, warning me while letting someone else take my place? I don't know, and I don't want to know. I quit my job that night. I don't care if I have to work at a gas station or a grocery store. I'm never setting foot in that airport again. But the worst part, I don't think it matters, because when I got home, there was a letter in my mailbox. No stamp, no return address, just my name, and inside, a single note: "I'll see you soon." When I was in college, I worked as a part-time evening custodian at my university. It wasn't the worst job. I got paid decently, and my shift started after most of the students had left for the night. My main responsibility was locking up buildings, emptying trash bins, and making sure classrooms were ready for the next day. Simple enough. One night, I was assigned to a building I didn't usually clean. It was one of the older halls on campus, mostly used for administrative offices and a few lecture rooms. The air always felt heavier in there, probably because the windows were too small to let in much light. It was a little past 10 p.m. when I finished my rounds and started locking up. I followed my usual routine, turning off lights, checking doors, making sure nothing was out of place. When I got to the last classroom on the second floor, something fell off. The chairs were all where they should be, the trash cans were empty, but the room smelled strange. Like metal, like pennies. I didn't think too much about it at first. I turned off the lights, locked the door, and started walking toward the stairs. That's when I heard it. Jingling. Not loud, not frantic, just a soft, rhythmic jingling of keys, like someone was walking behind me, casually swinging a set in their hands. I stopped. The sound stopped. I turned around. The hallway was empty. I assumed I was just hearing things and kept walking, but the moment I stepped onto the staircase, there it was again. Jingling. This time, closer. I turned fast, my heart hammering. Again, nothing. The hallway was completely still. I hurried down the stairs, trying to convince myself it was just my own keys making the noise. Maybe they had been rattling against my belt loop weirdly. That had to be it, right? I reached the bottom floor and locked the main entrance. As I stepped outside, I reflexively checked my keys just to make sure. I froze. My keys were inside my pocket. They hadn't been swinging at all. I turned, staring at the dark windows of the building, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me. But the windows were black, empty. Then, just as I was about to walk away, I heard it again. Jingling from the other side of the locked door. I didn't wait to find out what it was. I left as fast as I could, not even bothering to check if I missed anything anything. I told my supervisor the next day that I wasn't comfortable working in that building alone anymore. She just gave me a tired look and nodded. "You're not the first to say that," she muttered. I wish I could say that was the end of it, that after avoiding that building, I never had to think about it again. But that's not how these things go, is it? A few months later, I was still working my usual shifts, but I had successfully managed to avoid the old admin building. Then one night, my supervisor told me one of the newer guys had called out and they needed me to cover his routes. The same building. I told her I really didn't want to, and she just sighed. "Look, I get it. Everyone gets creeped out in there, but it's just a building. You go in, you lock up, you get out." I wanted to argue, but I needed the job, so against my better judgment, I agreed. It was past 9 p.m. when I walked up to the building, and I immediately felt that same weight in the air. The smell of old carpet and dust greeted me as I stepped inside. I reminded myself to work fast. The first floor went fine. Trash emptied, lights off, doors locked. No sounds, no keys jingling. I started to relax a little. Maybe last time had just been my imagination. Then I went upstairs. The second floor was colder than I remembered. The lights flickered slightly as I made my way down the hallway. I pushed open the last classroom door, intending to make this quick, but I stopped short. All of the chairs were pulled away from the desks, every single one perfectly spaced apart, facing the door, as if someone had dragged them all out deliberately. I had not left them that way, and I was the only one here. I told myself someone must have done it earlier in the day, maybe a meeting or some weird class experiment. I forced myself to move. I stacked a few chairs back into place, but something about the silence was wrong. It wasn't just quiet, it was like the whole building was listening. Then it happened. Jingle, soft, deliberate, from somewhere behind me. I whipped around so fast I nearly tripped over a chair. No one was there, but I felt it this time, like someone was standing just behind me, close enough that if I had turned a second later, they would have been right against my back. I did not stick around. I ran out of that room, slammed the door behind me, and rushed for the stairs. As I descended, I fumbled for my keys, my hand shaking. Then, as I reached the bottom, I heard the unmistakable sound of keys jingling against glass. I turned toward the front doors. Someone was standing on the other side. At first, I thought it was a reflection, but as I stepped closer, I realized they weren't moving like I was. The figure was just standing there, barely visible in the dim outside light, and in their hand, they were swinging something. His. My breath hitched. I couldn't see their face, but I knew they were watching me. And then, they lifted their free hand and tapped on the glass. Just once, a single, deliberate knock. I bolted. I didn't even lock up properly. I just sprinted across campus, my heart pounding so hard I thought I might collapse. When I got back to the main custodial office, my supervisor saw my face and immediately asked what happened. I told her. She just stared at me for a long moment. Then she did something that made my blood run cold. She reached into a desk drawer and pulled out an old set of keys. "These were found in that building last year," she said quietly. "We don't know who they belong to. There's no record of them being assigned to anyone." I looked at the keys, feeling sick. Then she said the worst part. "We never figured out why, but they kept showing up in weird places. Lockers, desks, even in a janitor's cart once. We put them away, and then a few weeks later, they'd be back." She stared at me, her expression unreadable. "You heard them, didn't you?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. I quit that job a week later. I don't know who or what was in that building with me. I don't want to know. And if you ever hear keys jingling in an empty hallway, don't turn around. After quitting, I did everything I could to put that place out of my mind. I got a new job, finished college, and moved to a different city. For a while, life is normally peaceful. I stopped looking over my shoulder, stopped jumping at the sound of keys. But some things don't stay buried. It started a year later on a random Tuesday night. I was back in my apartment after a long shift at my new job. I was unlocking my door when I heard it. Jingling, soft, distant, but there. I spun around, part hammering. The hallway outside my apartment was empty. Just silence, just shadows. I shook it off, told myself I was just paranoid. I went inside, locked the door, and tried to forget. But then it happened again and again. Sometimes at night, sometimes in the middle of the day. The sound would come from odd places, an empty stairwell, the grocery store aisle when no one was near, even inside my own apartment. I'd wake up to the faint jingling of keys, but whenever I searched for the source, I found nothing. I told myself it was just my imagination. I wanted to believe that, until the night I came home to find my old keys missing. I always left them on the kitchen counter, right by the fruit bowl. But that night, they were gone. I tore my apartment apart searching for them, panic rising with every empty drawer, every untouched shelf. And then, after nearly an hour, I found them neatly placed on my bedside table. I hadn't put them there. I knew that for a fact. Something cold settled in my stomach. I grabbed the keys with shaking hands, checking them over as if I'd find an explanation in the metal. And that's when I noticed something else. There was an extra key on the ring, one I had never seen before. A dull, old-fashioned key, slightly rusted, with no markings. was. I stared at it, the air in my apartment suddenly feeling too thick. My breath hitched as I thought about the keys my supervisor had shown me back at the university, the ones that had kept coming back. No, it wasn't possible. I yanked the key off the ring and threw it in the trash. I took the whole bag outside, walked to the dumpster, and shoved it in. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I checked the trash can, just to be sure. The key was gone, and I tried to tell myself someone had just taken the bag out, that I was overreacting, but deep down, I knew better. And then the final straw came. A week later, I got a package in the mail. No return address, no postage, just a plain, brown envelope. I almost didn't open it. Every part of me screamed don't, but I did. Inside was a single key, the same rusted, old-fashioned key I had thrown away, and attached to it was a small, yellow piece of paper. Just 3 words, written in neat, unfamiliar handwriting. You forgot this. I moved out the next day. I don't know how it found me. I don't know what it wants, but I know one thing for sure. No matter where I go, no matter how far I run, it still has the keys. I work as a maintenance technician at a small regional airport, not one of the big, glamorous hubs, just a quiet, mid-sized airport where most flights are domestic, and we close down after the last departure of the night. My shift runs late, making sure everything is in order after passengers and crew are gone. Most nights are uneventful. Most nights. Last Friday, a late flight out to Denver was delayed due to weather. It was the last departure, meaning my shift stretched longer than usual. By the time the plane finally took off, it was nearly midnight. The terminal emptied fast, cleaners finishing up, TSA shutting down their checkpoints, the last rental car counters closing. Within an hour, the place was deserted. I was doing a final walkthrough of Concourse B when I saw him. A man, standing at gate B7. That was strange. The flight from that gate had left an hour ago, and no other flights were scheduled. He wasn't a worker. I would have recognized him. He was dressed normally, jeans, a brown jacket, nothing remarkable, but he was just standing there, staring out the window at the empty tarmac. I cleared my throat, approaching. Sir, airport's closed. Can I help you? He didn't respond at first, just stood, unmoving. Then he spoke, without turning. I missed my flight. His voice was flat, expressionless. I glanced at the dark jet bridge, then at the departure screens. Everything was closed for the night. There were no flights left to board. I'm sorry, but all flights are done for the day. I said, you'll have to come back tomorrow. He turned to look at me then. I don't know how to describe it. His face wasn't wrong. Exactly. It was just, like someone trying to look normal but missing the details. His eyes were too still. His lips moved, but not quite in sync with the words. I missed my flight, he repeated. A cold feeling crept up my spine. Sir, I said, trying to keep my voice even. Do you have a ticket? He just stared. Then, slowly, he turned back to the window. I stepped away, pulling out my radio to call security. But before I could press the button, he was gone. Not walked away gone. Not out of sight gone. 1 second he was there. The next, the space was empty. I don't know how long I stood there, heart hammering, staring at that empty window. Eventually, security arrived, but of course, there was no one to find. They reviewed the cameras. Nothing. The footage showed me walking into the terminal, stopping at gate B7, talking to no one. No figure, no man in a brown jacket. Just me, alone, speaking to thin air. I don't know what I saw that night. I don't know who or what missed their flight, but I know one thing. Next time I see someone standing alone at a darkened gate, staring at the tarmac long after the planes are gone, I'm not stopping. I didn't sleep well after that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw him standing there at gate B7, staring out at the empty tarmac. His too still posture, the way his lips moved slightly out of sync with his words, and worst of all, the way he just disappeared. I tried to brush it off, told myself I was overtired, maybe even hallucinating from exhaustion, but when I went back to work the next night, something gnawed at me. I had to check gate B7 again. The concourse was empty by 11:30 p.m., just as it should be. I made my rounds, checking lights, bathrooms, locked doors. Everything was normal, but when I reached B7, my stomach dropped. The jet bridge door was unlocked. That shouldn't have been possible. All bridges are secured once the last flight departs. I had personally seen to it the night before, but now the door stood slightly ajar, like someone had stepped out and forgotten to close it behind them. A cold draft swept through the opening. I swallowed, stepping closer. Hello. No response. I pulled out my flashlight and shined it into the jet bridge. The light cut through the dim, sterile tunnel, revealing nothing but scuffed carpet and empty space. I reached for the handle, ready to shut it it and lock it properly. Then I heard it. A whisper, faint, almost like the sound of wind through a crack in the glass. But it carried words, just on the edge of understanding. I missed my flight. Every hair on my body stood on end. I swung the flashlight wildly, scanning the bridge. Empty, completely empty. But I knew, I felt, I wasn't alone. The whisper came again, closer this time. I missed my flight. I bolted. I didn't stop running until I reached the main terminal. Security found me breathless and pale, gripping the flashlight so tight my knuckles ached. I demanded they check the cameras. Again, the footage showed nothing. Just me, standing alone in the jet bridge, shining my light at something that wasn't there. They humored me, but I could tell what they were thinking. Exhaustion, stress, maybe even a breakdown. But I knew better. Over the next few days, I started asking around, casually at first. Had anyone else ever seen something strange near gate B7? Most people just shook their heads, but one of the older baggage handlers hesitated. He pulled me aside after his shift, lowering his voice. B7, yeah, there's something weird about that gate. He told me a story. Years ago, long before I started working at the airport, there was an accident. A flight departing from B7 was delayed due to bad weather, but passengers had already boarded. A nervous young man got up at the last minute, saying he needed to make a call. He stepped off the plane, down the jet bridge, and never came back. The weather worsened, and the flight took off without him. Halfway through the journey, the plane experienced massive turbulence. It never made it to its destination. No survivors. The man who missed his flight, he vanished. No record of him ever leaving the airport. No security footage of him exiting. He was just gone. For a long time, no one spoke about it, but every now and then, someone would report seeing someone waiting at gate B7 late at night. A man staring out the window at the tarmac. I don't work night shifts anymore. I traded shifts with a guy who doesn't believe in ghosts. I don't tell him why. I don't tell him what I saw or what I heard. I just know one thing. I avoided working the night shift for weeks. No more late walkthroughs. No more final checks at the concourses. I stuck to day shifts. Busy hours when the airport was alive with movement and noise. For a while, it worked. Then, last night, I got a call from my buddy Mark, the guy who took over my shift. Dude, he said, voice tight. You need to tell me what the hell happened at gate B7. I felt my stomach drop. What do you mean? I asked, already knowing the answer. I saw him. Mark whispered, or something. I was closing up. Like usual, B7 was empty, but when I walked past, I felt weird, like I wasn't alone. He exhaled sharply. Then I heard it. I gripped my phone tighter. What? The whisper. I missed my flight. And chill crawled down my spine. I turned around. Mark continued, and there he was, just standing at the window, looking out at the tarmac. His voice wavered. At first, I thought it was a passenger who got locked in or something, but when I called out to him, he didn't move, didn't react at all. I could hear him pacing through the phone. I went closer. I don't know why. I just had to. I squeezed my eyes shut. Mark, he turned and looked at me. My breath caught. His voice dropped lower, barely audible. Something's wrong with his face, man. It's like it's trying to be normal, but it's not. I swallowed hard. What did you do? I ran, he admitted, but when I looked back, he was gone. Just gone. Silence stretched between us. Then Mark muttered, I checked the security cameras. I knew what he was going to say before he said it. There's nothing on them. Just me, standing there, staring at the window, talking to no one. I sat down, my legs weak. You believe me now? I do. We didn't say much after that. What else was there to say? But before he hung up, he asked something that's been clawing at my mind ever since. Do you ever wonder where he goes? I hadn't. Not really. But now I can't stop thinking about it. He never leaves through the doors. He never appears on security footage. He just vanishes. Maybe he's still waiting. Maybe he's stuck. Or maybe he finally found a way to board. I don't want to know. I don't want to ever know. So if you ever find yourself at an airport late at night, near a gate with no flights left to board, and you hear it, that whisper, I missed my flight, don't turn around. I used to work as an event coordinator, handling everything from weddings to corporate retreats. One of the more unique events I was assigned to was a silent auction for an old estate sale. The house was huge, one of those grand, crumbly mansions on the outskirts of town that had sat empty for decades. The heirs finally decided to liquidate everything, and my job was to organize the auction where people would bid on antiques, furniture, and artwork. The house was still intact but had a heavy feeling to it, the kind where the air seems too thick, too still, like a place waiting for something. The owners had left behind behind entire rooms filled with belongings as if they'd simply walked away one day and never looked back. There were faded portraits lining the halls, bookshelves filled with dusty tomes, and cabinets locked tight with keys long lost. The auction itself was fairly normal at first. A small but dedicated group of collectors, antique dealers, and curiosity seekers placed their silent bids. People wandered from room to room, examining everything from old clocks to jewelry boxes. I was stationed near the main entrance, overseeing the process. Then, about an hour in, I noticed something strange. The big card had been placed on an item that wasn't on the catalog. It was an old wooden chair, tucked away in a side hallway. I knew it hadn't been included in the auction because we had cataloged every item meticulously, and this chair wasn't on any of our lists. It was unremarkable, just a plain, high-backed wooden chair with a dull patina, but someone had written a big card and placed it there. The bid was high, too high for such a simple piece. Thinking it was just a mistake, I went to remove the card, but as I reached for it, I felt something. A shift in the air, like the whole house was holding its breath. The moment my fingers touched the paper, I heard a whisper right behind me. Not words, just a sound. I turned so fast I nearly knocked over a small table, but there was no one there. Just the hallway stretching into the dimly lit rooms beyond. I forced a laugh at myself, folded up the big card, and stuffed it into my pocket. But as I walked back toward the main area, I swear I heard the sound of wood creaking, like someone shifting in a chair. The rest of the event was uneventful, except that when I checked the bid sheets at the end, another bid had appeared for the chair. A different handwriting, a different price, this time even higher. That was enough for me. I took the chair out of the auction, left it where I found it, and told the estate owners that it hadn't been listed in our catalog. They looked at each other, then at me, and one of them, a man in his 60s, just nodded. "We won't be selling that," he said, and that was the end of it. I don't know who placed those bids. I don't know why the chair was never cataloged, or why the air in that hallway felt so wrong. But I do know that when I checked my pocket later that night, the big card I had taken was gone. A few weeks after the auction, I found myself thinking about that chair more than I wanted to admit. I tried to rationalize the whole thing, stress, fatigue, maybe someone playing a prank. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something wrong with it. I avoided driving near the estate after that, but one evening, as I was heading home, I got caught in detour traffic that took me right past the house. The mansion stood there, dark and silent, its windows reflecting the fading light like blind eyes. As I passed, I thought I saw a faint glow in the hallway window. I told myself it was just a trick of the setting sun, but my stomach twisted into knots. I pressed harder on the gas and didn't look back. A few nights later, I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. I don't know why, but my heart was pounding like I'd been running. The room was quiet, and the faint glow of the streetlights filtered through the blinds. Everything seemed normal, except for the creaking sound. It was faint at first, barely audible, but as I strained to hear, it grew louder. It sounded like someone slowly rocking back and forth on a wooden chair. I froze. The sound was coming from the corner of my bedroom, where I kept a small desk and a chair. My chair, a modern cushioned office chair, didn't creak. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I reached for my phone to turn on the flashlight, but as soon as I moved, the sound stopped. The corner was empty. I barely slept that night. The next day, I called the estate owner, the older man who had told me they wouldn't be selling the chair. I hesitated to explain, not wanting to sound crazy, but eventually I told him everything. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "You shouldn't have touched it," he finally said. "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice shaking. "It's not just the chair," he said. "It's what sits in it." I demanded to know what he was talking about, but he only muttered something about keeping it locked away and hung up. The creaking sound came back the following night, louder this time. I moved out of my apartment the next week, leaving most of my furniture behind. I haven't heard the sound since, but sometimes, late at night, I think about that chair. I wonder if it's still in that hallway. I wonder if someone else touched it, and I wonder if someday, whatever sits in it will come looking for me again. For months after I moved, things were quiet. No creaking, no whispers, no strange feelings creeping up my spine. I started to believe that whatever had happened with that chair was behind me. Then, 3 nights ago, I found a big card in my mailbox. It was old, yellowed, with the same type of handwriting I had seen that night at the auction. No envelope, no return address, just a folded card with a single word written on it. Accepted, and I don't know how it got there. My mailbox is locked, and I live in a completely different city now. I don't even work at event planning anymore, but the moment I touched the paper, I felt that same heavy stillness I had felt in the hallway that night. I tried to throw it away, but my hands wouldn't let go of it. I had to force my fingers to unclench, and even then, it felt like something was resisting. That night, I heard the creaking again. Not in my apartment, not outside. It was over the phone. My phone buzzed at 3:12 a.m. with a notification, unknown caller. No number, no location. Just those two words, hovering on my screen like a warning. I don't know why I answered. Maybe some part of me thought it was the estate owner, that he was calling to tell me something I needed to hear. Maybe some other part of me already knew it wasn't him. I lifted the phone to my ear. Silence. Then the slow, deliberate sound of wood creaking. I hung up and turned my phone off, but the noise didn't stop. It was in the room with me, close enough that I could hear the slight shifts in weight, the subtle shift of all wood adjusting to movement. I didn't sleep. At dawn, I packed a bag and left my apartment, checking into a hotel across town. My hand shook as I locked the door behind me, and for the first time in years, I prayed that this thing, whatever it was, wasn't following me anymore. But I know better. This morning, I found another big card slipped under the door of my hotel room. There was no bid amount this time, no price, just a simple note, written in the same uneven script. Your turn to sit. I'm leaving town. I don't know where I'm going yet, but I won't stay in one place long. If you ever see an old wooden chair in a place it shouldn't be, if you ever feel the air go still and hear wood creaking when no one is there, don't touch it. And if you find a big card with your name on it, run. This happened when I was in college, back when I still pulled all-nighters in the campus library before big exams. It was mid-semester, and I had a huge test coming up, so I decided to stay late at one of the study halls on the far side of campus, an old building that had been repurposed for general student use. It wasn't as crowded as the main library, which made it ideal for cramming. The building was a little outdated, creaky wooden floors, flickering overhead lights, and a ventilation system that groaned every few minutes. But I liked the solitude. I didn't mind the occasional weird noise. I had settled into a desk near the back of one of the larger classrooms. Most of the other students had left by 10 p.m., but I stayed, scribbling notes and flipping through textbooks, only looking up when I heard the occasional door creak in the hallway. By midnight, I was completely alone. At least, I thought I was. I had my earbuds in, lost in concentration, when something made me pause. It wasn't a sound exactly, more like a feeling, like the air in the room shifted. The hairs on my arms stood up. I took my earbuds out and listened. Silence. Then, in soft movement, I turned toward the classroom entrance. The door was cracked open slightly, but I could have sworn I had shut it all the way earlier. Hello, I called out. No answer. I figured maybe the air vent had pushed it open, or maybe I was just imagining things. I shook it off and went back to my notes. A few minutes later, I heard a sound. A shuffle, a slow, deliberate movement, like the soft drag of a shoe across the floor. This time, it wasn't from the hallway. It was from inside the classroom. I snapped my head up, scanning the rows of empty desks. The fluorescent light above me buzzed softly, casting dim shadows over the room. Nothing looked out of place. Then I noticed something. One of the desks in the farthest row, near the back, wasn't empty anymore. Someone was sitting there. They were facing forward, completely still, hands resting on the desk. My pulse spiked. I knew for a fact that no one had been there before. I couldn't see their face, just the outline of a person sitting in the shadows, their form just barely distinguishable in the dim light. Hey, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. No response. I felt my skin prickle. My chair creaked as I slowly stood up. The figure in the back didn't move. I took a shaky breath, grabbed my backpack, and walked toward the door as casually as I could. My footsteps echoed in the empty room. The whole time, the figure didn't react, but the second I reached the door, just as I was about to step out, the desk chair scraped violently against the floor. I didn't look back. I sprinted down the hallway, my footsteps pounding against the wood. When I finally reached the exit, I turned once just to check if I was being followed. The hallway was empty. I didn't go back to that study hall again. The next morning, I asked a friend about the building. He hesitated before saying, that place, they shut it down for a few years. Some kid, years ago, had a breakdown during an exam and just never left. Security found him sitting at a desk in one of the classrooms, totally unresponsive. When they tried to move him, he freaked out, screaming, thrashing. They had to call someone to take him away. After that, people started seeing weird stuff, figures in empty rooms, chairs moving on their own. They ended up reopening it eventually, but man, I wouldn't study there alone. I never did. I told myself I was done with that building. No more late night study sessions, no more testing my nerves in an empty classroom. But some part of me, maybe the same part that made me stay in that place in the first place, kept replaying that night over and over. What if I had looked back? That thought gnawed at me for weeks. One night, against every ounce of common sense, I decided to go back. Not to study, not to stay long, just to prove to myself that I wasn't losing it. It was about 8 p.m., earlier than before, but the building was already mostly empty. The old fluorescent lights buzzed above me as I walked down the familiar hallway. My heart pounded harder with each step. I reached the door of the classroom. It was closed this time. I hesitated before gripping the handle. Slowly, I pushed it open. The room was exactly as I remembered it. Rows of desks, dim lighting, the faint hum of the vent overhead. Everything looked normal, except for one thing, the chair in the back row. It was pulled out, facing forward, like someone had just been sitting there. I swallowed hard. My brain scrambled for rational explanations. Maybe the janitor moved it. Maybe another student sat there earlier and just forgot to push it in. Then I noticed the notebook. It was on the desk where the figure had been sitting that night. An old, battered composition notebook. I stepped closer, my breath tight in my chest. The cover was worn and stained, but the edges of the pages were crisp, like someone had been using it recently. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and flipped it open. The first page was filled with cramped handwriting, and then I saw the words, "I said you." My stomach dropped. I flipped to the next page. "Why didn't you look back?" My blood turned to ice. I felt the roof pressing around me. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then, a soft scrape of movement from behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly knocked over the desk. The door was closing. Not slamming, just slowly, steadily closing. I lunged for it, my fingers fumbling with the handle, and yanked it open. The hallway was empty. I ran again. This time, I didn't stop running until I was off campus, gasping for breath in the cold night air. I don't know what I saw that night, or what left that notebook for me to find, but when I checked my own notes later, the ones I'd been writing that first night, the last page had something scrawled in the corner, something I know I didn't write. Sigisone. I tried to forget. I really did, but some things don't let you forget. I stopped pulling all-nighters, switched study spots, and even avoided that entire wing of campus. My friends noticed how jumpy I'd become, but I didn't tell them the full story. I barely admitted it to myself. For a while, it worked, the nightmares faded, and my life settled back into normal. Then, a few weeks later, I woke up to a notification on my phone. A single text from an unknown number. "Why didn't you look back?" I sat up so fast I nearly fell out of bed. My heart pounded against my ribs. I stared at the screen, my fingers trembling. I didn't reply. I didn't even breathe for a few seconds. Then, after what felt like an eternity, I convinced myself it was a prank. Maybe someone had overheard me talking about that night. Maybe one of my friends was messing with me. I deleted the message and tried to shake it off. But that same night, something else happened. I was in my dorm, finishing up an assignment, when my laptop screen flickered. Just a glitch, I thought, but then the cursor started moving on its own. I watched, frozen, as a document opened. Then, letter by letter, one keystroke at a time, words began to type. Sigisone. I slammed the laptop shut and threw myself back from the desk, breathing hard. I wanted to believe it was some kind of virus, some freak tech malfunction, but deep down, I knew better. This wasn't over. And then, the worst thing yet, that weekend, I went home to visit my parents. I needed a break from campus, from everything. I thought I was safe, until I heard it. I was lying in bed, half asleep, when a sound drifted through the open window, a chair scraping against the floor. My stomach turned to lead. Slowly, I sat up, heart hammering in my chest. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate drag. It was coming from downstairs, from the dining room. I grabbed my phone, barely able to hold onto it with how slick my palms were. I wanted to text my dad, wake someone up, but I was too afraid. Instead, I crept out of my room, my breath shallow. Step by step, I made my way to the staircase. The house was silent, too silent. I gripped the banister and peeked down into the darkened dining room. The table was empty, but one of the chairs was pulled out. Sitting in it was the notebook, the same battered composition book I had found in the classroom. It was open, and on the fresh, untouched page, in the same cramped handwriting, were two words. Look back. Something moved in the shadows. I read it. I never went back to that classroom. I switched colleges by the next semester, moved states, deleted my old number, and tried to erase every trace of that night from my life. I don't know if it worked. I haven't heard from it since. No more texts, no more notebooks, no more sounds of the night. But sometimes, when I'm alone, in a quiet room, studying late at night, I feel it, watching and waiting. Alright, but that's it. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my channel, like this video, and comment something down below. But as always,
Have a nice day.